Hello and welcome to the 10th video of making a matrix style animational widget. Today we're going to be focusing on continuing on our JavaScript. So let's have a quick look at what we'll be making. Okay, so this is the plugin that we're going to be doing. This is the front end widget, and we're going to be looking at the promises that we need to create the loop from the front of the widget to go to our JavaScript backend. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Let's have a look at the tasks that we're specifically going to complete. Okay, so these are the tasks. We're going to be creating an infinite loop at the front end, so that we keep passing those phrases into the back end. We're going to be using a promise for that, and we're going to be just making sure that we have a counter that changes that phrase each time. And basically we're going to be using promises to do this. So let's have a quick look at how that will look in the plan. So we've done the JavaScript object, we've already created the front end, we've got the phrase array. Now what we're going to be making today is this logic that loops through that phrase array and passes that each phrase through to the JavaScript matrix object. So we've done all of this in previous videos. We just need to make sure that we start connecting them up. Okay, so we're here at the matrix folder. What we need to do first is we need to go to the front end widget, and we need to call the matrix get text data method. So what we need to do first is open up our matrix widget file. We need to find that front end, which is going to be in the widget function. And before we call the method within our class, within our JavaScript class, we need to first create the object, because we haven't created the object yet. So I'm just going to create the object. Oh, I can't write anything because it's still in the quotations for PHP. But this is the quotation object. If we just make sure we go to here, we have to insert one argument in here, because to automatically call the constructor, it needs this DOM. So we need to put this matrix tile into this argument, and then we've created our matrix object from the class that we created in JavaScript. So we've created the object. Now we need to create a loop. So I would suggest going on to my JavaScript event loop video and learning a little bit more about how JavaScript executes its code. So the reason that we can't just use while true for this infinite loop is because JavaScript is a single threaded language on a single processor. So what that means is if you have one piece of code that's continuously being executed, it's going to take all that processing power and it's going to hugely affect performance of the website. So we cannot use a while true to complete our infinite loop. So what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be actually creating a function, and I'm just going to call it loop, and then I'm going to call that function, and then what will happen is it will go down, and then the function will be called, and then we will enter into that function. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the matrix get text data function, and then what will this do is this will call the method within our JavaScript. It'll call this method. However, we still have not created that loop. So what we're going to do is we're going to be using a then. We're going to be using a then I guess a promise, as it were. So But basically what's going to happen is saying, well, once this is complete and that we've returned it, that it's been successful, what do we do after that? Well, I'm going to say, once that's complete and then that's successful, I want us to do another function, and then this function is going to say set timeout, which is JavaScript that just says have a pause, and then after that pause I want you to call this loop again. And then so by doing that, we are creating our infinite loop. So what's happening here is we're going into the function. Once we're in the function, we call this we call this method. Then we use this promise, and it says if this method is successful, execute this function. And then this function is saying, well, this one is just saying pause for 800 milliseconds, and then after that pause, call this loop again. And so we need to make sure that that we create something on the JavaScript to tell the code that it's successful, the promise is successful, and we need to make sure that it's always successful. And then we've created our infinite loop. Now, to kind of make sure that we're passing the title, what we need to do is we need to add a counter so it changes. So the first counter it's changed to will be 0, and then we can add in that parameter into our method. Because remember, when we call that get text phrase or get text data a method, we want to insert the new phrase. So we want to insert that new phrase. Okay, so then what we need to do is then make sure that that phrase is added in the counter, so that that phrase goes up. Yeah, so each time the phrase changes, so because we only have two values, 0 and 1, we want the first one to be 0, then the second one to be 1, then the first one back to be 0, then 1, then 0, 1. However, if we add more phrases, we don't want to change our code at all. We just want to it to go 0, 1, 2, and then 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2. And so I've just used this little mathematical glide of code here to do that. So it's going to be focusing on the remainder here, and that will determine which phrase we are using. What I would say is that it's really important to understand how things like the set timeout and the then function operate in terms of their execution order. So things like the set timeout is not actually executed with the, let's say, the environment, the JavaScript section processor. What happens is there's a separate web API processor within the browser, and there are a number of commands that are executed in that section of the JavaScript environment. And so if you don't have a good understanding of how the order is executed, it's very common to be tripped up by this. So what I would suggest is have a look at that video describing or explaining that JavaScript event, the event loop, as it were, and get a good idea of how JavaScript actually executes its code. So now that we've done that, let's have a look at our objectives. So I've created that loop because once we're in this function, we cannot come out of it, because unless there's been a failure in our JavaScript backend. So it's basically saying this method is called in our JavaScript. If it's successful, wait a period of time, 800, and then call this again. Okay, but because even though we're calling it here, because of the way that JavaScript is executed, we still run this code. This code still gets run, and this code is run before this is called. Okay, so we have done that. We've added our promise, which is our then, or we added the first bit of our promise. So we've added then, which is saying if it's successful, then I promise to do this. We added a counter, and that changes our phrase each time we send it into the get text data method. Now, what we haven't done is we haven't actually created our promise in the JavaScript class, so that's what we need to do now. Okay, so what we're going to do now is in the main JavaScript file, in the get text data file, we need to create a promise that, when resolved, will make the then statement happen. So what we've done here is we are attaching the resolve onto the this property or this attribute. Now there's a lot of things happening here in this sentence that can be quite confusing. So for example, this for an arrow function doesn't point to the actual function itself, but it's pointing to the owner of the function. Okay, so that's talking about the matrix thing. So again, it's still pointing to the matrix thing, even though in normal functions this is pointing to the function itself. And what I'm doing is I'm saying I'm attaching this resolve item to the my promise attribute here. So which means that when I call this promise will be resolved. So at the moment this is going to be returned undefined, but once I call this elsewhere in my code, this will be resolved. So it's a handy way of, if you see most promise examples, you can see that it is that within the promise it defines the conditions that will make it be resolved and the conditions that it will be rejected in. And this is slightly different because what I'm saying is that I will determine when it's resolved later on and not in this code. So what I've done online here is that there's I've gone to Stack Overflow to kind of give you some additional things that you can kind of search it. So one is resolve JavaScript promises outside function scope, and if you go down, and it talks about how you can defer it. Additionally, I've got a little article here that says resolve promises externally with this one weird trick, and again it's kind of it's creating this deferred option, the object as it were, that you can use elsewhere to tell that promise that is complete. Okay, so this is a little bit of a tricksy little line of code, or not that one, this one, because there's many new factors within it. We have the arrow function, we have this that doesn't point to the actual function itself but the owner of the function, and then we also have this resolve thing attached to this attribute here that then we can then call later on, and that will be called here when we use a if statement to see if the complete is equal to the length. So all we need to do now is to make sure that we return our promise at the end. So we just need to, after this is called, return that promise here. So that should be everything, all our 5 tasks for this video. There was some, I guess, a little bit more difficult concepts in this video, but the idea of learning how the order is executed when you do things like set timeout, or how the order is executed when we make a promise, is important to know. And then how we would create that promise when we have to have these two conditions, the resolve condition and the reject condition, is important for you to maybe search outside of this video. Okay, so thank you very much, and we're going to go straight on to some concept checking questions now. Okay, so here are the concept checking questions. Have a look through them. Stop the video and then try and answer them. A couple of things that you need to bear in mind in the question 2, I'm talking about which is executed first, this loop here that's on the 41 line, or this line 44, which one is executed first, and then what does this .then mean? I'm referring to this .then here. So let's go through it. Hopefully you've stopped the video and you've answered the questions. Let's go through and see if you've got them right. So the reason why you can't make a while true loop is that JavaScript is a single threaded language, which means there's one processor that executes the code. So if you've got this while true loop going on, there's nothing else that can be executed while this is happening. Some languages has multiple threads which you can use to simultaneously execute the code. However, JavaScript can't do that. However, saying this, this catches a lot of people out, because in the browser you have this JavaScript environment, and then this environment has, let's say, two sections. You have the normal JavaScript processing unit, the processor, and then you have this API processor. So there's certain things that JavaScript will say, hang on, I need to send this to the API processor to process. Not everything, but there's certain things. So for example, set timeout is one of them. What will happen is that JavaScript processor, the single thread, will look at this and say, hang on, this is not something that I need to execute. I'm going to send that on to the API processor. And then the JavaScript processor will continue down. And then the API processor will process this set timeout. And then once JavaScript has finished everything in this JavaScript main code, it will then reinsert this JavaScript code back onto the processor and it will be executed. So actually line 44 is executed first, and then line 41 loop is executed. Now if that's a bit confusing for you, you need to check out the event loop, and I'll leave in the description a link for you to have a look at what that does and how that works. Watch it, because it's really useful to understand the execution order of certain things. And what does a promise do? Number 3, a promise is like most things, it's saying, in this code I promise that I'll eventually complete something, but while I wait to complete something, I want you to continue doing some other stuff. So within a promise you need the actual, say, hey, I'm going to make a promise, and then you need two conditions. One to say the promise, the condition has been met, the other one, the condition has been rejected. In my example, I have just used the resolve condition, so I've only included this, but you will see the reject one. And then you have a resolve action, which is once the promise has been completed, what do you do next? But the main thing is it's saying, well, I will do this, but I can't do this right now. Give me a bit of time, and while I'm waiting, you can do some other stuff. Okay, so in our code, what we actually did here is we've attached that .then to a different section. So we have attached it in our code to the made front-end widget. But usually what you'll see is this is a typical promise that you can see elsewhere. So you have a promise, you declared the promise, you're saying that you have a resolve function and reject function. To get the resolve function, first you have to wait you'll have to do the set timeout. So I want you to wait 1,000 milliseconds, and then when you resolve it, once that's 1,000 seconds are up, we've resolved the promise, it's complete. And then after that, I want you to do this. So this happens. But you can also chain it up. So you can say first this, then this, and then this. So in here, we can say, oh, well, after that, we want to do that. And after that, we want to do this. Okay, so that's a more typical one. However, in our code, we didn't want to have a condition to resolve the promise within its function. We've basically binded it to the attribute, and so that when we call that, then the code knows that our promise has been resolved. So ours is a little different, but the same meaning applies to it. So hopefully you've got all the concept checking questions. Again, if you feel that these videos have been useful to you, or if you would like to say that you're enjoying it, please leave a comment, please like it, let me know that people are listening and enjoying it, and I will continue making it. So goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.